All right, so we kind of got up to contemporary research, and I showed you there's all these different fields, and most of those fields at this point are going to use some kind of research, some kind of scientific process to explore whatever questions they're interested in. So research is a really important topic to understand if you want to understand psychology. So key takeaways for this lecture, one that you might have already concluded from my last slide previously, the research methods and designs in psychology are going to be as numerous and diverse as the subfields. So every subfield is going to have their own kind of methods and techniques that they use. So there's no way that I can cover all of those today, so I'm just going to give you kind of brief overview of like the most common ones, kind of general designs. One thing we'll talk a little bit about is the difference between correlational research and experimental research. Something you might have heard about before. If you know nothing about that, don't worry, we'll get into it. But one of the main things I want you to take away from today is that each of those really have their own strengths and weaknesses, and they complement each other very well. So, a really good theory should have evidence from different methods from both correlational and experimental research. And then we'll end by talking about some of the ethical issues that we need to consider when we're doing research in psychology. And we'll kind of return to some history there. We'll talk about some of the issues that have come up in the past and how those have been kind of addressed and hopefully resolved, but some of the maybe ethical issues that still exist in psychological research now. All right, so like I said, a lot of people within the field of psychology use the scientific process or the scientific method. The scientific method is a little more detailed than this. I'm just going to talk about kind of the general process of sort of how to do science, basically. So in science, we're usually starting with a question, which can usually then be reframed as a hypothesis. And a hypothesis is basically like an educated guess about what we think is going to happen in a particular study. For hypothesis, we then use empirical observation to verify whether that hypothesis is supported or not. And we do this through a process called deductive reasoning. So the book talks a little bit about this and gives an example. I'm going to borrow the same example from the book if any of you happen to have read the first chapter. So for example, I might come up with a theory that all living things require energy. Let's say that's my theory and I want to test that. Then I might make an observation that ducks are living things. And so one way I could test my theory is to try to figure out if ducks also require energy, right? If all living things require energy, a duck is a living thing, then for my theory to be true, it must be the case that ducks also require energy. So then I could do a little, set of experiments to figure out if that's true or not. If I find, yeah, ducks do require energy, then that kind of supports my original theory. If they don't, then that might refute that original theory. So that's called deductive reasoning. So we're starting with a general statement, right? The general statement is all living things require energy. And then we're kind of working our way down to a specific case, which is the duck. All right? Sometimes we might come up with incorrect hypotheses or theories, right? So I might come up with a theory that all living things can see, for example, right? Based on my observations of the world, that might, be like a reasonable thing to conclude. But then I find out, okay, well, plants are living things. So from that, if my theory is all living things can see, plants are living things, then my hypothesis would be that plants can see, which obviously is not true, right? So again, I could do a little test, a series of experiments to find out, no, actually plants cannot see. So my original theory, there must be something flawed or wrong there. But main point, deductive reasoning, you're starting with a general sort of statement and then working down to specific cases to test that. And then through the process, the scientific process, we basically use inductive reasoning then to sort of alter our hypotheses or come up with hypotheses. So inductive reasoning is going in the opposite direction. You're starting from a specific case and then generalizing from that. So I might have come up with my theory that all living things can see because I make these observations. I look around the room and I see, all of you, at least in this class right now, can see. And so that observation of like, well, I can see and you can see is very specific. So if I'm going from specific to general, that's called inductive reasoning. So usually we use inductive reasoning to come up with our hypotheses and then deductive reasoning to test if those hypotheses are correct or not. And psychologists do the same thing, right? I might come up with a theory that, a particular pill, or let's say this, got to make it general. Let's say I have a theory that, imbalances in the brain cause mental disorders. All right, so then I might look at a specific instance of mental disorders and see, like, is there something going on in the brain that's causing that, right, in order to test that. And if I find a particular instance, okay, this person has a mental disorder, but everything in their brain is perfect, then I'm going backwards, right? I'm taking that specific person, and now I'm changing my hypothesis. Okay, maybe I need to change my theory to something else. So that's kind of the general process that's used in all science, including, the psychological fields that are scientific. So what makes a good theory? There's a few things that you want to pay attention to, and I would say to, as much as possible, maybe have these kind of in the back of your mind anytime we talk about a theory in psychology. Kind of ask yourself, is it meeting these criteria? One of the first things is that it has to be falsifiable. So what that means is that if I come up with a theory, and I'm saying this is a scientific theory, then I should be able to think of a way that I could prove that theory wrong, okay? If I cannot think of a way that I could prove that theory wrong, then it's probably not a good scientific theory. This is one of the reasons that we have a separation between like science and philosophy, or even like science and religion, right? I can say, I think God exists, for example, and that may or may not be true, but it's very difficult to come up with a way to falsify that. It's very difficult to come up with like, what's a scientific method to prove God doesn't exist, right? If someone could have thought of that by now, then they would have probably gotten rich and like changed the world, right? But it's not really easy to do that. One of the criticisms of Freud, one of the reasons I avoid him, is because a lot of his theories were not really falsifiable, especially at the time that he created them. So he talked about this idea that the mind is made of like the id, the ego, the superego. That might be something familiar to you. If it's not, don't worry about the details. But especially at the time that he lived, there wasn't really any way to prove that that wasn't true. So his ideas were much more in the realm of philosophy instead of scientific theory. Good theories should also fit all the available data and observations. So if I, come up with a theory and then an observation goes against that, then that's, a piece of evidence that maybe this theory isn't true. Good theories should also make useful predictions. So from a theory, I should be able to say, if X happens, then Y is going to happen. Right? So again, in psychology, if I have a theory that this particular medication is going to help treat depression, then I'm basically making a prediction. I'm saying if this person with depression takes this pill, their symptoms are going to get better in the future, right? So good theories should make useful predictions. And then kind of one of the last premises of a good theory is this idea that's called parsimony. Parsimony just basically means that if we have, let's say we have two competing theories and they both meet all these criteria, then usually we're going to go with the one that is simpler, the one that has like fewer parts to it or that's less complicated. So a less complicated or more simple theory is going to be preferred over a more complicated one as long as they both meet all these other criteria. Okay? So again, throughout the quarter, as we talk about theories, maybe just kind of ask yourself these questions. Like, does this theory meet these criteria? Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. The nature of science is that we sort of do the best we can with what we have at the time. And we recognize that maybe this isn't 100% correct, but we're always open to like changing that theory if new data comes that disproves it, or if it stops making useful predictions. So these are all really general things about science, in relational research. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but in order to do this study as an experiment, what I would have to do is I'm going to go find a bunch of kids, and I'm going to take half of them, and I'm going to just subject them to a bunch of trauma. I'm going to do a bunch of just horrible things to this half of kids. This other half of kids, they get to have a great life. They're not going to get any trauma. And then I'm going to see, as an adult, what are their relationship issues like, right? Obviously, I could not ethically do that study. I wouldn't want to do that study. So pretty much the only way I can do it is through correlational research. So anytime you have something like that, you're going to have to go with correlational instead of experimental. All right, pause. Any questions? Okay, so the alternative, we already talked about a little bit, the alternative to correlational research is experimental research. So in experimental research, the main difference is that the researcher is going to control one or more of the variables that's involved in the study. So kind of like I was just saying, if I wanted to do that as an experiment, I would have to control the kind of trauma that those kids go through, right? The variable that we have control over is often referred to as the independent variable, okay? I put that here just because then I talk about it in other areas. It's easier to talk about if I name it. So we control one variable, and then we see what impact that independent variable has on some other variable, right? On two or more, or one or more dependent variables. So in my childhood study I was talking about, again, this would be terrible to do, but if you controlled the trauma, that's your independent variable, and then we're looking at how does that impact them in adulthood. That's your dependent variable, the thing you're like measuring or examining. So, a more realistic example of what I could do, I feel like I've used this example a lot today, but let's say I'm developing a new medication to try to treat depression, and I want to know if this medication works more effectively than the stuff we already have on the market, okay? One of the common medications that's used right now is called SSRIs. So let's say I develop my medication, I don't know, we could name it whatever, Larissa's medicine, okay? So we have Larissa's medicine, I'm gonna give that to half of my depression patients, and then I'm gonna give the other half the SSRI, and I'm gonna compare them to see their depression symptoms and see if they get better. So the medication they're getting is the independent variable, that's the thing I have control over, I decide which one they're gonna take. And then the thing I'm measuring is their depression symptoms, like do they get better or not. So everybody understand the difference between a correlation and an experiment? Okay. So the main strength of experimental research is that it can be used to determine causation. Yes? Okay, go ahead. If I did the study I just talked about, I find that Larissa's medication ends up with better, improvement of depression symptoms than the SSRI. Then from that I could conclude that my medication causes those depression symptoms to get better, okay? So that's the strength. The weakness, I guess, or the limitation, I guess I should say, is that it is often unethical and impractical to implement an experiment depending on your research topic. So especially I think in psychology, because we're often, first of all, we're dealing with people, which we have lots of regulations on people, right? It's the reason behaviorists use animals is because they can put animals in a cage and they can control their diet, they can control when they sleep, they can control if they get to have access to like mates, they can control everything about a rat's life, right? But I cannot do that to a human unless they consent, which even in that case, if they consent to that, it's probably still breaking some law or APA guideline or whatever. And so because of the issues we deal with in psychology, because we're dealing with people, it often, like I said, you end up with a lot of correlational research because it would be unethical to do that study as an experiment. All right, speaking of ethics. So, like I've said many times now, psychology has this history of very unethical research practices. And this is just a list of some of the most famous ones, some of the most egregious cases. I probably should have also put, Holocaust as number one on here, because like I said, there were lots of instances of people, working under the name of psychology to do terrible things. But these are some of the, the more well-known ones. So one is the Milgram shock experiment. I also maybe should have put dates. I would say probably all of these were like prior, well, I don't know. Does anybody know when the Stanford prison experiment was? That one's pretty famous. There's been
Wasn't it in like the 70s?
That's what I was thinking. I was about to say all of these were before like the 1960s, and then I saw that one on the list and I was like, no, that's not true. So Milgram shock experiment, I want to say that one was like 50s or 60s. And actually this came out of kind of trying to understand how the Holocaust happened. And, why is it that there were these millions of people who joined the German army and were willing to do like really terrible things to people, that they might not have otherwise done? And why did they allow such terrible things to happen, basically, is kind of what this experiment was trying to examine. And they were basically arguing, Milgram was arguing that almost any person, if you put them in a position where a person of authority is telling them to do something terrible, they will probably do that terrible thing. That was kind of his hypothesis. So what he did, he had his participants come into this room. There are videos of it online, but the video quality is like terrible because it's old. It's from like the 1950s, but you can find it if you're interested in seeing. Yeah?
They actually redid it a little while ago, a couple of years ago, so there was a
Yeah. I should find that then. That's a good idea. I would assume the recent one probably followed much more strict APA guidelines and things than what this one did. So in the original experiment, he brings in the participants, and they're in this kind of room that's like split in half, and there's like a glass window that separates like one person from the other person. Okay, so the participant comes in, they're on one side of this glass window. There's another person on the other side. The other person on the other side is what's called the confederate. So that means there's someone who's like part of the experiment. The researcher has hired them to be there or whatever, but the participant doesn't know that. The participant thinks that that's another just random stranger participant in this experiment. Okay, that's important to have in the back of your mind. So the participant comes in, the researcher tells them, and the researcher has like a lab coat and a clipboard, very like authoritative looking or whatever, and tells them, okay, we're gonna do this test on, I think it's like memory or something. I don't even remember what the like cover story is. But basically they say, okay, you're gonna read this word pair, and the person on the other side of the glass, they have to repeat it back after like some distraction or whatever. Okay, so the real participant, they read this word pair, ocean, dog, or whatever. And the confederate is now supposed to say that back, or something like that. I don't know if I have the details right, it doesn't really matter. But the point is, the participant, if the confederate gets it wrong, the participant's supposed to push a little button that's going to shock the confederate, okay? And it starts out like very low, like basically just a vibration, like if you had a Fitbit on and it vibrated, it would feel like that. But then they're supposed to ramp it up. Every time the confederate gets it wrong, they're supposed to escalate that shock, make it higher and higher, and shock them every time they get something wrong. In the video, so the confederate's not really being shocked. They're a paid actor. But again, the participant does not know that. So it gets to the point where the confederate is like screaming in pain, begging to stop, like asking this person, like, please don't do this anymore, I want to leave. But the authoritative person keeps telling the participant, no, go ahead, it's fine, keep doing it, right? And they find that, whatever percentage of their participants will follow through and do that, basically. Now, I should say this was done, so obviously there's a lot of deception going on here, right? The participant thinks that this confederate is really getting shocked when they're not. The participant also thinks that the study's about like memory or something. They have no idea what the psychologist is actually looking at. And it's a very traumatic experience, right? You could imagine if you went through that, you come out of that study, the stress and everything that you're gonna feel is gonna be pretty high. So eventually this, study was shut down, and it's often used like today as an example of like some unethical research practices. So I would guess the modern one at the very least like uses better informed consent and probably other methods that make it so that it's ethical, or else it wouldn't have been done, is my guess. Okay, some of you raised your hand, how many of you have heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment? There's like quite a few at this point, like movies and I think maybe series and stuff about it. It was done by a researcher at Stanford, that's why it's called that, named Bandura, I think was his name. And he basically did this study. It was kind of looking at the same idea as Milgram. Like if you put people in a position of authority, then what are they willing or capable of doing? So he had these students basically assigned to be either a prisoner or a guard. And he built this little like miniature prison in the basement of Stanford. And he had half of the students basically act as the prisoners and half are the guards or whatever. And he just picked them at random, basically, right? Like this random half is going to be the guards, this random half is going to be the prisoners. And it just very quickly went off the rails, basically. So the prisoners were put in these little prison cells. And he basically just let the guards like run wild and do whatever they want. Like you can run this prison however you want to. By the end of it, I think it only lasted a couple weeks or something, and they had to shut it down. But by the end of it, some of the prisoners had been forced to like wear women's clothes. They had their bedding took away. They didn't have access to bathrooms. Like, there was just very horrible treatment of these prisoners. There were lots of faculty at Stanford who were telling Bandura, like, you need to shut this down on like day 1 or day 2. And he just refused and like kept the experiment going and going, basically. There's, like I said, lots of documentaries and stuff, so if you want to know more detail about that one, you can find it very easily. And then the last one I'll talk about here is the Watson-Little Albert experiment. I kind of briefly referred to this earlier. So Watson was a behaviorist, but he actually studied humans a little bit more than animals, but he used kind of the behaviorist ideas. And he did these experiments where he basically tried to show that you can condition a child to be scared of anything. So there's again another video that's very low quality, but also very creepy, of him. For some reason, he's wearing this really weird mask. I don't know why. I don't know if that has anything to do with the study or not. I guess maybe it does. But there's a baby. He has like a little like newborn baby, like a baby that can just barely sit up, still in diapers, probably like 6 months old or something. And he presents it with like a bunny, right? And at first the child's like loving this bunny, like petting it, super excited, super happy. But then over time, what he does is he puts the bunny in front of the child, and then he bangs on this like metal bar with a hammer and makes this like crazy loud noise. The baby's crying, screaming, like super scared or whatever. And he does that over and over again. So he's pairing the bunny with this loud, scary noise. By the end of it, the baby, like as soon as he brings out the bunny, the baby's screaming, terrified, wants nothing to do with it. And I would imagine probably that kid went on to be, terrified of animals for the rest of his life, probably. So that was the Little Albert experiment. So again, he's just trying to show, like, I can condition this child to be scared of anything. There was the woman I referred to, I'm forgetting her name off the top of my head, but she used Watson's techniques to basically reverse fear that I talked about earlier. Okay, so that's a lot. So, there's all these different cases of, like, pretty obviously terrible experimentation that goes on in the field of psychology. In addition to those, there's also many cases, this is maybe more modern, of what's called data manipulation or fraud. It seems to be really prevalent for some reason in the field of social psychology, but it's gotten into other fields as well, where like a researcher, a little bit of context might be helpful. So, professors at like big universities, like if you go to a big state school like Oregon State University or Washington State University, most of the professors there, their job is based more on research than teaching. So for them to like get paid and get promotions and stuff, they don't care too much about their teaching. They care more about like, are you doing research that gets grant money that comes into the school, okay? So for them to do that, they have to publish this research. They have to get it published in journals that like their peers review or whatever. And so often there's a lot of pressure to like be pumping out research as much as possible. And so some people will basically cheat the system. So instead of actually taking the time to do these experiments and these studies, they will just like manipulate their data completely. So there's cases where they've just made up data from scratch. There's cases where they'll do the experiment, but the results don't match their theory. They don't match their hypothesis. So then they'll change the data to make it match their hypothesis so that they can get published and they can get promotions. Okay, so hopefully all of you can see why that's clearly super unethical, right? They're cheating the system, which means they're cheating other people out of getting those positions and those promotions. But they're also creating a lot of confusion and misinformation within the field. If I read a study and I think like, okay, this theory in social psychology seems to be true, now I'm going to go and do research in that same theory, and then I'm finding like, I'm not finding any of these same results, right? Then like there's all this confusion now within the field about like what's real and what's not. So it causes all kinds of issues. And then another huge ethical issue that's been historically true that is getting better but still not great is that a lot of marginalized populations have been excluded from research on both sides. So, if I go back to my list of people when we were talking about the history, if you start looking at pictures of them, pretty much all white dudes, okay, for the most part. I intentionally included a few women, but I had to dig to find those women. And like I said, a lot of those women were not even allowed to get PhDs, literally just because they're a woman, right? You will see, I don't think that there's a single person of color on that slide if you look at pictures, right? And so there's all these populations that have been very intentionally excluded from doing this research. So let's think a little bit about like what impact does that have, right? If it's all a bunch of white dudes doing the research, then all the questions that get asked are what they think are important or relevant. And then there's all these other questions that, like, as a woman, I may be interested in. As a person of color, I might be interested in. But if I'm excluded from the field, then there's no opportunity to pursue those questions or that research. So then there's all these gaps that, like, we don't really understand the psychology of women as well as we understand the psychology of men because it hasn't been studied as much, basically, right? So that's from the researcher side. But then in addition, the participants also are often, well, it depends. If we're talking about most studies that are done at a college, they're going to be like educated white dudes, again, usually wealthy too. Okay, so the participants in the studies are also, not very diverse, except for, the caveat. I don't think I have any examples of it here, but there are some pretty atrocious studies where they intentionally select marginalized populations to be their participants because they can kind of get away with it better, basically. So that's a pretty huge ethical issue historically. Again, maybe getting better, but still not great. I see lots of uncomfortable faces. That's okay. Sometimes psychology is uncomfortable. It happens. All right, so a lot of that stuff I just talked about happened pretty much like World War II and prior, like 1940s, 1950s and prior to that. Especially after the Holocaust, there was a lot of like movement to try to come up with some rules and regulations to make research more ethical, not just in psychology, but also in like the medical field in lots of places. So the modern ethics are mostly regulated by the APA, which is the American Psychological Association, and then IRBs, or institutional review boards. So at most universities, if they do research, basically what they have to do, like if I wanted to do a study, then I would have to fill out this whole like very lengthy application where you describe everything about your study. Like, what are you planning to do? What's your hypotheses? What's the theoretical basis? What population are you going to use? Are you going to, you pretty much have to use what's called informed consent, where you tell your participants, like, this is what this study is going to involve. These are the risks. These are the benefits. Do you want to participate or not? And that's an ongoing thing. Like, they can quit at any time throughout the study. The IRB also asks about, are you using vulnerable populations? Just lots and lots of questions that they basically ask about your particular study. And then you have to get approved through them before you can carry out that study. So there is a lot more oversight and regulation. There are, though, I think, modern issues that IRB can't necessarily address very well, especially things around, technology-based things. So it's very easy now, like I said, I could put together a survey and send it out and not have to go through the IRB because it's so easy to just access, different survey platforms and things. So there's a lot of gaps in the regulation. I'm starting to lose my voice. This always happens the first week or so of lecture. I have to readjust to what's the volume I should talk at to not lose my voice by the end of class. And I haven't readjusted yet, so it's going.